Shalom chavarim v'chavarot, or hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Everson, bringing you some information on Joshua and Judges. Hopefully, you're doing well, and this information is interesting and useful to you in your lives and your ministry. And hopefully, it's just clear enough so you'll do well on the test at the very least. The book of Joshua, important, famous book in the Old Testament. Let's talk about its historical background. Who wrote the book of Joshua? Well, like most biblical books, it is anonymous. The text doesn't come out and say who wrote it, just like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and Deuteronomy before it also don't say. Some people think that it was written near the time of the events. One argument that's used to this end would be the Hebrew phrase ad hayom hazeh, which means unto this day, unto the day, this one, literally in Hebrew. This phrase, I just did a quick search before I typed up the slide. You find it over a dozen times in the book of Joshua. And what's interesting about this phrase is that it's referring to the time of the writing of Joshua. It's referring to the time of the author of Joshua. It's not referring to the events that are recorded. They're saying this happened back then, and such remains to be the case even now as I write this book. And so you get a reference to the time of writing as opposed to the historical events described. And one of the passages that is interesting is in Joshua chapter 15, verse 63. It refers to the Jebusites. The Jebusites are the folks that controlled the city of Jerusalem prior to David taking over Jerusalem. And if that's the case, if the book of Joshua, and it talks about how the Jebusites inhabit the city until this day, if the book of Joshua was written at a time when the Jebusites controlled Jerusalem, this would refer to a time prior to King David conquering the city of Jerusalem. And so there you would have a very early date for the book of Joshua, sometime during, just sometime before David. Who knows when that could be. It could go close to the time of Joshua, it could be in the period of the Judges, it could be at the sort of the start of the United Monarchy. Anyway, that's just one argument that's used to provide an early date for the book of Joshua, which is interesting, and it's a clue found within the text. The prevalent view among liberal scholarship or skeptical scholarship would be that was really put on the page by a guy named Note. TH in German is always a hard T these days, so Luther for Luther. Martin Note came up with this idea of the Deuteronomic or the Deuteronomistische Geschichte, the Deuteronomistic history. And it is the idea that during the days of exile in Babylon, a very sad time in the history of Israel, there were a group of scholars who sort of surrounded themselves around the theology of Deuteronomy. And they sought to explain why the sky fell. Why did things fall apart? Why did this great kingdom become one that was conquered and humiliated and destroyed? And they live this second class, this miserable life in exile as a joke. And they look forward to the day that they might return to the promised land. And so during this time period, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings were all written. And they were written to explain the tragedy. And this is, for Note, and those that follow him, the Deuteronomistic history. And it's a very prevalent view. I've become disenchanted with it myself, mainly because it's an effort of speculation. It's a grand speculation. When you look at, and of course this involves source criticism, when you look at the different sources that people find within the text, it becomes almost ridiculous. I copied a page from, I think I mentioned Campbell and O'Brien and a previous text. They have this work, Unfolding the Deuteronomistic History. And within 8 verses, they detail 5 different sources, or 5 different authors, 5 different hands. And so in one verse, it's this author. In the second verse, it's this author. In the third verse, it's a third author. In the fourth verse, you go back to the first author. In the fifth verse, you go on to yet a fourth author. And then in the 8th verse, there's a 5th author. And so they see all of these seams of the text bouncing back and forth between all of these different authors. And it's been sewn together in this very elaborate sort of patchwork of a text, this elaborate redaction. And they have no proof for any of it. It's all just speculation. And so I just find it uncompelling and highly speculative. And yet a large group believes this, right? And Orwell would call, I would call this Orwellian groupthink, where the herd just follows along this path. And I'm happy to deviate from the herd when it comes to Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Now, the last point here for the historical background, the book of Joshua is the completion of the Exodus. It's the other half of the Exodus, right? They leave Exodus, they make their exit out of Egypt so that they can make their entry into the Promised Land. And so this is the fulfillment of that promise. And if you recall from the days of Abraham, or from our discussion of Abraham, there were 3 promises that were given to Abraham, and I remember them with the letter P. There was property, which is land, progeny, which is offspring, and there was prosperity, which would be fame and wealth. These things were promised to Abraham, and land was one of them, right? That the Israelites would find a place where they might make their home, right? A land flowing with milk and honey. And so this is what the book of Joshua is. This is the conquest or the settlement of the Israelites into the land of Canaan. Okay, now what do we do with the date for the book of Joshua? I mentioned the Ad Hayom Hazeh, unto this day up above. There's a lot of archaeology that's done in dealing with the book of Joshua. Of course, the Exodus and the conquest, or the book of Exodus and the book of Joshua, go hand in hand, right? Because there's a short amount of time between the two, right? Namely 40 years. And so there's arguments for the date of the book of Exodus, which we've talked about before. Who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? Was it Amenhotep II, or was it Ramses II? And if the Exodus is suspected to be 1446, well, then that's Amenhotep II. And then you're going to be looking for signs of destruction, right, where the Israelites conquered cities within Canaan. Now, within the book of Joshua, you really only get a description for destruction for 3 cities, and that would be Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. And Ai is a bit of a question mark. Well, the most famous of the 3 cities in terms of excavation would have to be Jericho. Years ago, the most famous archaeologist initially to look at Jericho was a guy by the name of Garstang, and the conclusions he came up with fit very well with the biblical date for the Exodus, namely a 15th century Exodus. And so he thought that Jericho was, the walls fell and the city was destroyed around the year 1400. Later, a woman named Kathleen Kenyon did her, this would be back in the days of William Foxwell Albright. There's a very famous sequence of archaeologists, namely Wright, Albright, and John Bright. And their names all rhyme, so it's sort of convenient. But this was sort of mid-20th century archaeology that argued for a 13th century Exodus. And so it was liberal scholarship back in the day, but these days it would be considered conservative scholarship because they found evidence to support the Bible. And Kathleen Kenyon would be sort of a part of that movement. And so when she excavated the city of Jericho, she found that it was not inhabited during the 15th century and around the year 1400. Nobody lived there, but there were destruction layers from a later time period. And then back in the 1990s, there's a very famous conservative archaeologist named Bryant Wood who re-examined the evidence and looking at trade routes and among other things, he found support for a biblical exodus in around the year, well, a biblical exodus in 1446 and a conquest of Jericho around the year 1400. And so he would date the conquest to the so-called early date around the year 1400 BC for Joshua. And so there's a lot of scholarship that goes into it. I just briefly mentioned some of it with Garstang Kenyon and Bryant Wood. I can point you to a number of useful resources if this is something you're interested in. There's more information than you can imagine, right? Books upon books have been written on this stuff. If you look in your textbook, the conquest as it's described in the Bible is, I'm getting onto the third point here, 5 liberal skeptical options. The conquest as it's described in the Bible is really not an option for liberal scholarship. The idea that the Israelites left Egypt and then they entered Canaan and conquered the land and then settled the land. And so they need to come up with other theories because eventually you do have Israelites living in the land, right? By the time you get to the Persian period, by the time you get to, the 500s and the 400s BC, there's a lot of people there who say that they are Israelites and they have this history. And so how do you explain this group of people who are living there, who have the story of how they came to live there? And so you need to come up with another explanation for the advent of the coming of Israel. And so in your textbook, you have a number of options, and it gets into folks who study literature and folks who study archaeology. And you have those that would totally reject any type of settlement at all. And this would be Davies and Lemke. Lemke being a very famous proponent of sort of a skeptical view. Another option would be an immigration model that's favored by the likes of Alt and Note. Another option would be so-called peasants' revolt model, which, is sort of a Marxist, the workers unite and they overthrow the powers that be, and Mendenhall and Gottwald would point to that. A very popular and famous Old Testament archaeology that's somewhat conservative would be a guy by the name of Deaver, and he has the so-called collapse model. I'll just quote from your textbook here. He points to evidence that the highlands of central Palestine at the beginning of the Iron Age have evidence of numerous, about 300, new settlements. In light of the fact that the large Canaanite coastal cities now show signs of collapse at the end of the late Bronze Age, Deaver sees the origins of Israel in this move from coast to hill country. And so he argues for the so-called collapse model. And then lastly, another very famous skeptical archaeologist would be a guy by the name of Israel Finkelstein, and he has the so-called cyclic view. He believes, I'm quoting on top of 127 here, he believes they are part of a cycle where nomadic peoples will eventually settle down. Thus he associates these cities with settled nomads. And the last two, Deaver and Finkelstein there, are heavy into the archaeology. I came across a podcast that could be useful, and I'm going to create a document for you all with interesting links, and I'll put this one in there. There's a sort of an apologetics podcast out of England you might be familiar with called Unbelievable, and they do virtually, besides creation, they do virtually nothing with the Old Testament. So it's a lot of atheist versus Christian, or Christian versus Muslim. It's hosted by a guy named Justin Brierley, who is, I think, a great host. And it's the sort of debate where folks are often seeking understanding, so they're very useful debates. They're done in sort of a spirit of goodwill or generosity, so they're often useful. This debate on the history of Israel, basically the conquest and the Exodus is the debate. It's useful in that the main positions are given, and you can get a sense for how people argue and where they're coming from. The two folks in the debate sort of talk right past each other, which often happens, and maybe that's unavoidable sometimes. But that can give you a good sense for the first option of the 5 liberal skeptical options, namely total rejection. This guy is a fan of Lemke, and he gets into source criticism. So there's that. And then when it comes to questions of historicity and how do we know the Bible's true and what do you do with archaeology, some of these things can be a little exhausting, and you might feel like you need to sort through mountains of propositions and logical propositions and figure and try to sort through all of this stuff and come up with your own conclusion based upon extensive reasoning and analysis, and it can be exhausting. And maybe I'll post this in that document as well. Tim Keller was at Princeton once in the so-called Veritas forum, and he was interviewed by Martin Bashir from ABC, and then there was an atheist professor who also has a conversation with him. And regardless of how you feel about Tim Keller, he does a fantastic job in speaking with goodwill and seeking understanding. And the debate he has, I think, is very fruitful. And he has sort of this C.S. Lewis argument when it comes to the Old Testament. And that is, he makes it Christological. He comes to the point of saying, if Christ is who he says he was, then we can trust the Old Testament with confidence, because Christ is the Son of God, and he trusts the Old Testament and points to it as something that is valuable and true. If Christ is not who he says he was, then the Old Testament doesn't matter. And so I think for folks like ourselves, people of faith, this can be a useful starting point. That is to say, Christ points to the Old Testament as something that is true and historical and valuable, and whatever we do with these debates, we can sort of rest in that, and hopefully that can be useful to you as well. So those are just some ideas, issues surrounding the date of the book of Joshua and the date of the conquest. Okay, moving on to the structure. This is sort of just what happens in the book of Joshua. You've got the conquest, which occupies the first 12 chapters. These are sort of exciting chapters or disheartening chapters, depending on how you feel about one nation conquering another. Myself, I really don't like war. I'm basically a pacifist, and so I've had to do some soul searching and my own sort of apologetics in terms of coming up with a defense for the Old Testament and what to do with the idea of one nation conquering another with violence to occupy a land. But anyway, you've got the conquering of Jericho and Ai initially, then you've got the so-called Southern Campaign in chapters 9 and 10, the Northern Campaign, and then this large list of cities that were overtaken by the Israelites in chapter 12. And then after that, you move into the ordering or the arranging of the tribes. And so you have a list of the tribes and their allotted territories. And this would be, for ancient Israelites, this would be a very exciting, this is like the paycheck, right? This is what they had been waiting for and what they had been hoping for. And this would have an enormous amount of significance for those folks. And then the book of Joshua ends with a covenant renewal ceremony. So the covenant is renewed and the people are sent forth. And so Joshua here is a lot like, he's a kind of Moses, or he's a type of Moses. However, the stage for the book of Judges is set in that Joshua has no replacement. He doesn't set anyone up to take over after him. So there is no singular leader after Joshua. Right? No one sort of takes over the mantle of leadership like he did for Moses. All right, moving on to theology. You have the idea of holy war, or the idea that God calls the Israelites to go to war against the people that are living in the land of Canaan. And it's through this that they're able to occupy the land. So the people are either chased away or they are killed. Now, ever since World War II, this has basically been illegal, right? The United Nations does not, except for the case of Israel, the United Nations does not approve of, honor the acquisition of land through violence. Although that was the norm for all of human history. And I don't want to, defend that as being something that's legitimate, but this is what humans did for as long as you can read about what humans do. Humans acquire land through victory, through conquering. And this is what the Israelites do as well. And so this is a part of the Old Testament. And now what do we do with that? This is troubling for a lot of modern folks today. This wasn't troubling for anybody in the ancient world. This was a sign of God's strength and power and provision. And there are folks that will go to bat for the Bible to come up with a way of understanding or defending the morality of the Bible. There's a few resources I can point you to. Walt Kaiser and here I've got it on my shelf. Walt Kaiser has this text called "The Hard Sayings of the Bible." It's Kaiser, Davids, Bruce, and Brauch. IVP publishes it. It's called "The Hard Sayings of the Bible." Geisler and Howe, and this is Baker, Baker Books. They have the quote-unquote the Big Book of Bible Difficulties. They have a text in there. They have a text entitled "The Big Book of Bible Difficulties," where they deal with the morality of conquest. And I know Geisler's explanation, or Geisler and Howe, they point to God's sovereignty over creation. They point to the guilt of the Canaanites, right? If you look at what Canaanites got up to, they weren't innocent, right? So you have, and how do you remove a culture like this? Anyway, that's one of the things he points to. There's the old standard, which has a lot of good stuff in it, would be Gleason Archer's The Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, and he too would make an appeal to the morality of the Bible in light of holy war. Okay, so there's that. In the book of Joshua, we also have a theology of land, right? The land is acquired, it's distributed. We have sort of this idea as well. We all have this deep longing to be at home, to be settled, to be surrounded by friends and family. We don't like to be sojourners. It's uncomfortable to be in a strange place surrounded by strange people where you don't feel settled. And if you've ever moved away from your home, you can understand how unsettling that can be. And so within Joshua, you also have this theology of land. Also, you have more covenant theology in the book of Joshua. So your textbook on 131 talks about how the book of Joshua, I'm reading from the first paragraph here, is concerned to show life under this book of the law, what that would look like. And of course, this book of the law is Deuteronomy. Going down a bit here, Joshua leads the nation in the covenant renewal of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal in accordance with the specific command of Moses. Excuse me. Going down a little farther, both curses and blessings are set before Israel at the time of Joshua's death, just as they had summed up the stipulations of the law in Israel's covenant at the time of Moses' death. At the time of his death, Joshua, like Moses, was certain that the nation would not keep the covenant. So the idea of covenant and the anxiety that accompanies a potential breaking of the covenant. You see that within Joshua too. All right, so that's just a few thoughts on the book of Joshua. Moving on here to the book of Judges, we have the woman Jael there about to plant a stake in the head of her enemy. Judges, the background for Judges, of course, it's the link between the conquest and the monarchy, right? So that's the historical background. It's the hinge, it's the link between the two. The book of Judges is a time of upheaval or a time of chaos, not only in Israel's history, but among her neighbors as well. There's a number of power struggles that are going on. There's empires that are collapsing. There are empires that are rising up during this time period. And Israel is sort of in that transition as well. And so it's a time of chaos. Of course, there's the repeated phrase in the book of Judges that it was a time when there was no king in the land and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so it has this reputation for being like the Wild West, right? Or at least the Wild West as it's described in dime novels. I've heard from some historians that Western America in the 1800s really wasn't all that wild. It was pretty tame. It was just anyway. Okay, so a time of upheaval. Okay, in terms of authorship, similar to the book of Joshua, there's a phrase that shows up repeatedly in the book of Judges, that is a time when there was no king in the land. And in Latin, they would call this a terminus postquem, or a time after which. So it was probably written at a time after which there was a king. That is to say, it was written when there was a king, right? So by mentioning a king, it shows that it was written at a time when there was a king. Just like today, if I wrote about my childhood back in the 80s and in the 90s, you know, I'd say it was a time before there were cell phones in the land, right? So I'd be writing now at a time when there were cell phones in the land. So some people say it was written later at a time when there was a king. And so it was written during the monarchic or the time of the monarchy or the divided monarchy. So anyway, and of course tied into Judges is the whole argument of the Deuteronomistic history. And so I'll just leave that one reference there and we'll move on to the next point. The literary structure of Judges. You have a prologue, which is just a chapter, and refers to all the nations that had not been conquered by the Israelites, and it sort of sets the stage for the conflict that's coming. And this is interesting because when you read the book of Joshua, it seems like you have this, you know, the Israelites are just marching through, conquering people left and right, and they're getting things sewed up, and there's peace in the land, and everything's great. And then you get to the first chapter of Judges, and it's like, oh yeah, here's all the people that weren't conquered. And so you do have, for as much as people might wring their hands over holy war and violence, there were all sorts of people that weren't conquered by the Israelites, and you can read about them in the first chapter of Judges. And in the middle, in the center of the book of Judges, you have this, well, your textbook calls it the center. And it's the story of the judges, namely Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gibeon, Jephthah, and Samson. And in each one of these stories, you have a sequence of events, right? And some people like to call it the judges cycle. And I remember it just like with the promises of Abraham. I use alliteration to remember it, right? So Abraham, it was property, progeny, and prosperity. In the judges cycle, I use the letter R. And in each one of these stories for the different judges, the story begins with rest, right? And there was peace in the land for so many years. And so it begins with rest, and then it's followed by rebellion, right? And the rebellion might have to do with idolatry, right? They begin worshiping a false god, and that's bad. And because of their rebellion against God, there is retribution. So God allows the Israelites to come into harm because of the rebellion against him. And again, this would be traditional wisdom, as we talked about before. If you do something bad, then there's a negative consequence. So bad things happen to bad people, sort of a thing. And the retribution then would be, well, the Philistines or some other group rises up against the Israelites. And because of the retribution, the people sort of see the error of their ways, and they experience guilt and remorse for their actions. And so there is repentance. They repent before their God, and they cry out, seeking salvation, and they have regret. And once there's repentance, then there is restoration. God raises up a judge, Othniel or Ehud or Deborah or whoever raises up a judge to save them. And so rest, rebellion, retribution, restoration, or maybe I should say rescue. Okay, let me back up. So it's rest, the people rebel, so it's rest, rebellion. After rebellion comes retribution. After retribution comes repentance, and then after repentance there is restoration or rescue. So a judge is the Spirit of the Lord comes upon one of these judges, and the people are rescued or saved. I should add in here that a judge is not it's not Judge Judy. It's not a Supreme Court justice or something like that, but it is, in Hebrew, it is somebody who is a military leader, right? It's somebody who saves the people from their difficulty, much like a king would, right? And so this is what you have. You have military leaders who are raised up to save the people, and this is what a judge is in the Old Testament. And the cycle, it's maybe not fair to call it a cycle, because it's not like you come back to exactly where you started. When it sort of comes around again, things are worse. Some people describe it as a downward spiral. Things get worse and worse and worse. And by the time you come to the epilogue in the book of Judges, the Israelites are sort of hitting bottom. There's the story of Micah's idolatry, and the Levite and his concubine, right? You're all reading through these books as the course proceeds, and so you've come across these stories. And particularly the Levite and his concubine it's disturbing, and it's graphic, and it really sets the stage for a king, right? Things are getting out of hand, and so they need a king. And not that kings necessarily make things better, right? Oftentimes we feel like we need a powerful force from the state to solve things, and yet states become evil themselves and do horrible things. So, but this is the book of Judges. It's this downward spiral from one judge to the next. I will say that if you're somebody who's interested in sort of feminist interpretation and looking for powerful female characters within the Old Testament, the story of Deborah and Jael is a great one, right? There's a prophecy involved that you think it's going to be Deborah, but it's not. And there's sort of cunning and a surprising turn of events and salvation. And these stories are they're very interesting to read, and they're good fodder, good fuel for preaching, right? You learn about God's character, you learn about the plight of the Israelites and making bad decisions and finding salvation when you're in a tough spot. So anyway, that's the Book of Judges. I hope you're all doing well, and we will talk to you later.